The worst news of this entire war reached Vladimir Putin not from his enemies in Kyiv, but from his own finance officials. According to Bloomberg, senior figures inside the finance ministry and the central bank have told the Kremlin that this war is in the long run simply unaffordable. It is the clearest sign of a split inside Moscow since the start of the full-scale invasion. While the Kremlin's war chest drains and the National Wealth Fund has shrunk by around 60%, Vladimir Putin sits inside a fortress whose stores are slowly running dry. The walls are still standing, the front is still holding. But deep inside, where no one is looking, a crack is running through the foundation. And at precisely this moment, with Russia's economy contracting for the first time in 3 years, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz steps in front of the cameras in Berlin and promises Ukraine the very weapons that will make every additional day of this war more expensive. No numbers, no names, no timelines, just a single sentence that shakes the entire calculation Moscow's strategy was built upon. So let's take a look at how Germany is widening a crack that already runs through the foundation of the Kremlin, and why this quiet day in Berlin may be far more dangerous for Putin than any open threat. To understand why this moment carries so much weight, we first have to look at the fortress it is aimed against. Because, at first glance, Russia looks anything but vulnerable. For more than 3 years, the Russian war machine has ground its way across Ukraine. It has absorbed losses that would have shattered any other army, and it has held its lines at the front. For 2026, Moscow has set aside a defense and security budget that swallows almost 40% of all state spending, a mountain of money, keeping the largest military machine in Europe running. Over the skies of the occupied territories, the Kremlin stretches a dense net of air defenses, S-400, and Pantsir systems, each one worth hundreds of millions of dollars a wall that supposedly leaves no opening. This is the image Vladimir Putin wants to sell the world: an impregnable bastion, a country that can endure more than the West, an enemy whose patience outlasts that of the democracies. And it is on exactly this image that the Kremlin built its entire strategy. Putin did not bet on tanks and missiles alone. Above all, he bet on a single assumption that the West's resolve would eventually crack, that voters in Europe would grow tired, that the bills would grow too high to keep paying. And nowhere did that assumption look more justified than in Germany. For years, Berlin argued over the Taurus cruise missile, the German weapon with a range of over 500 kilometers, capable of striking deep inside Russian territory. The previous government under Olaf Scholz refused to send it, afraid of escalating the conflict. Month after month, it was debated, delayed, postponed. The Kremlin learned to count on this German caution like an insurance policy. As long as Berlin hesitated, so the thinking went, the most dangerous range stayed out of reach. German restraint had become without meaning to a part of Putin's own line of defense. And for a long time, everything really did seem to point that way. Even Friedrich Merz, who had loudly campaigned for the Taurus, while in opposition, fell silent on the subject once he took office. As recently as this spring, he argued that Ukraine's real problem was no longer a shortage of equipment, but a shortage of money. From Moscow's point of view, the picture was clear: the most powerful state in Europe would keep paying, but would not strike. The fortress could feel safe. And it is right here at the peak of that certainty that the decisive question is worth asking: what happens to a fortress whose greatest weakness lies not in its walls, but in the arteries that keep it alive? Because on June 3rd, on an unremarkable day in Berlin, the calculation flips. Merz steps up to the press beside Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson, and with a few calm sentences, he severs the certainty the Kremlin had leaned on for so long. German restraint, Putin's silent insurance policy, is suddenly history. At first, what Merz says that day sounds almost offhand. According to the Anadolu news agency, the chancellor explains that for months, Germany has been working closely with the Ukrainian government on what he calls long-range fire capability, and that the Ukrainian army will be equipped with these systems. But the truly remarkable thing is not what he says, it is what he deliberately leaves out. He names no quantities. He names no delivery model. He does not even name the system, and when asked directly about the Taurus, he sidesteps the question. This secrecy, he makes clear, is no accident but strategy, a certain amount of uncertainty toward the Russian side, he says, is necessary. And this is where the first layer of the story begins to unfold. Because strategic uncertainty is itself a weapon. As long as Moscow does not know what is coming out of Berlin, what range, what payload, what moment it has to defend everywhere at once, every assumption about Ukraine's reach becomes unreliable. The fog that Scholz once feared as a weakness becomes under Merz a coldly calculated instrument of pressure. Because an enemy who does not know where the next blow will fall must brace for the worst everywhere. It ties down forces in places where nothing may ever happen. It spreads its already scarce air defenses across the entire country, and it makes its decisions flying blind. With a single silence, Merz has forced Moscow to plan against an invisible enemy. But that sentence out of Berlin does not stand alone. This is the second and perhaps most important layer. Germany is not lighting a new front. It is lengthening a blade that is already buried in the flesh of the Russian war economy. Because while the world stares at the trenches, Ukraine has for months been waging a different, quieter war deep inside the Russian rear. Reporting from Ukraine paints an almost ghostly picture at secret sites out in the countryside. In the dark, almost silently, attack drones are assembled. Men in body armor move with quick, practiced hands, their headlamps glowing red so as not to be seen. Then the drones lift off one after another from makeshift runways and vanish toward the east, built from parts made in a scattered network of small workshops and able to fly farther than at any earlier point in this war. What looks so improvised is in truth a strategy of surgical cold. The target is not the soldier in the trench, but the heart that supplies the Russian war machine with energy and money. According to independent analysts, including the Institute for the Study of War, Ukrainian long-range drones have struck 24 of Russia's 33 largest refineries since 2022. In doing so, they have knocked out roughly a quarter of the country's fuel production and about a third of its gasoline capacity, and the damage to Russia's oil infrastructure is estimated at over $13 billion. A source in Ukraine's SBU intelligence service said that nearly 40% of Russian refining capacity is already idle. And this is no one-off blow, but a relentless hammering. A single refinery has been hit 16 times over the course of the war, and some drones have flown around 1,700 kilometers deep into Russian territory, into a space the Kremlin had believed was beyond reach. The consequences are devastating. Russia's oil refining has fallen to its lowest level in 12 years, gasoline has to be rationed in some regions, and Moscow, once a fuel supplier to half the world, is now importing gasoline from Belarus. Even Putin has had to publicly admit that fuel is running short. These are not the symptoms of an impregnable fortress. These are the symptoms of a body having its arteries clamped shut one by one. And this brings us to the third layer, the geographic one. A fortress is only ever as strong as its supply, and that is exactly where in the rear behind the front, Russia's soft underbelly lies exposed. The Institute for the Study of War reports that since early May, Ukrainian forces have intensified their strikes on Russian logistics at operational depth. In the occupied regions of Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, they are systematically cutting the ground supply routes, the lifelines along which ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements flow to the front. and the effect reaches all the way to Crimea. By some accounts, the entire peninsula is now largely cut off from its supply lines. Picture it a fortress whose walls still defy the enemy out front, while behind it one artery after another is being severed. This is exactly where Merz's promise lands. Greater range does not simply mean shooting farther, it means cutting deeper, reaching farther back into the places where the Kremlin had long assumed its depots were safe. Because Ukraine's strikes have already forced Moscow to move its fuel stores farther from the front, which only makes the supply convoys longer, slower, and more vulnerable. Every increase in range pushes that boundary deeper into the interior until there is no safe rear left at all. And the stranglehold does not end on land. Ukraine has long been striking Russia's maritime lifelines, as well oil tankers, platforms, and sea terminals in the Black Sea, the Caspian, and even the Mediterranean, the arteries through which Moscow pumps its oil out into the world and squeezes from it the hard currency that funds the war. Ukrainian officials call this campaign their long-range sanctions, and the term hits the mark where diplomats pass resolutions, drones sever pipes. Piece by piece, the exports are choked, the revenues are drained, the Kremlin's financial room to maneuver narrows. For a country whose entire prosperity and entire war effort hang on oil, a siege pressed from every side at once is in the long run nearly impossible to bear, and it can turn catastrophic. Here, a fourth layer comes in, and it may be the most consequential of all because it turns a one-time gift into a lasting threat. Merz's announcement does not come out of thin air. Already last year, Berlin began not only delivering weapons, but financing Ukraine's own arms production. According to the AP news agency, Merz pledged to help Ukraine build its own long-range missiles, free of any Western-imposed restrictions on their range or their targets. Germany's defense ministry confirmed an agreement to finance the production of long-range weapons inside Ukraine itself. In other words, Germany is not just handing a blade across the table, it is helping Ukraine build its own forge. A weapon you deliver can be used up. A factory you finance keeps producing month after month beyond the reach of any political debate in Berlin. And Merz made it unmistakably clear that the West is no longer setting Ukraine any limits, neither on range nor on military targets on Russian soil. For a fortress that had been counting on the enemy's supply eventually running dry, this is the worst news of all. The besiegers' stockpile is growing while its own is shrinking. That fourth layer leads straight into the fifth, the cold arithmetic of cost. Russia defends its skies with air defense systems worth hundreds of millions of dollars apiece. Ukraine attacks it with drones that often cost just a few thousand. A cheap drone assembled in scattered workshops against an S-400 worth a fortune that is the face of this new war. And the sheer volume overwhelms the defenders. By some estimates, Ukraine has destroyed up to 300 Russian air defense units over the course of the war. And although Moscow is rushing in additional Panzer and S-400 systems to protect its refineries and depots, the blanket simply is not big enough to cover everything at once. Wherever the air defense is thickened, a gap opens somewhere else. Ukraine has tuned its tactics to exactly that, saturating the defenses with entire swarms of cheap drones until one gets through and one is enough to set a refinery ablaze. In March 2026, Ukraine launched more drones than Russia for the first time in this war. Moscow's air defense, however dense it may look, is spread thin across more than 1,000 kilometers of interior and cannot be everywhere at once. And now, when German precision with greater range meets that already overstretched defense, the equation shifts further still. It is the old logic of every siege turned on its head. It is not the most expensive shield that wins, but the cheapest spear that finds a gap. Yet perhaps the decisive layer is the sixth because it ties all the others into a single strand. In Russia, fuel and money flow through the same artery. Every refinery hit is not just less gasoline for the tanks at the front, it is also fewer petrodollars for the state budget. That is exactly what that SBU source put his finger on the drop in oil revenue strikes directly at the aggressor's ability to keep fighting. The International Energy Agency expects Ukraine's attacks to keep weighing on Russia's refining operations well into 2026. So the geographic blade and the economic blade are one and the same. And while Ukraine severs this artery from the outside, Merz is promising to drive it deeper. On top of that, the chancellor in Berlin pointed to yet another front threatening Putin's coffers, the hope that the European Union will soon agree on a mechanism to use frozen Russian assets for Ukraine's defense. Money from Russia's own vault turned against Russia's own war. Before we pull the last thread, it is worth looking at the second half of Germany's strategy, because Berlin is handing Ukraine not only a sword, but a shield at the same time. While Russia wages what Merz has called a terror war against the civilian population, striking Ukrainian energy sites to plunge the country into darkness. Before winter, Germany has placed a clear emphasis of its aid on air defense, from Patriot interceptors to radar systems. The symmetry is striking the same alliance. Helping Ukraine hit Russian refineries is also helping it keep its own power plants alive. Russia is meant to feel what it dishes out, while Ukraine is shielded from what it dishes out. For a fortress that had been counting on grinding the enemy down through cold and darkness, that too is a calculation that no longer adds up. And this brings us to the final layer, the one that reveals the full scale. This is not the solo move of a single country. Germany is, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, the second largest backer of Ukraine after the United States. For 2026, the Merz government has pledged a record package of around 11.5 billion euros in direct military aid, more than ever before since the war began. And on this day, Merz does not stand alone, but side by side with the Swedish Prime Minister, an image of Northern European unity. The giant the Kremlin had so long written off as hopelessly hesitant is now pulling the rest of Europe along with it. It is precisely because it is Germany that is moving that this shift weighs so heavily. Here, though, an honest caveat is needed, and Merz himself insists on it. Berlin emphatically stresses that it is not becoming a party to the war. Germany supplies, it does not fight. Yet it is exactly this combination supply without direct confrontation that hollows out Moscow's ability to threaten. Because what is the Kremlin supposed to aim its retaliation at when the weapon is fired by Ukrainian hands built in Ukrainian workshops with a range that no one in Berlin will officially confirm what begins in the rear ends at the front? An army marches on its stomach, the old saying goes, and a mechanized army marches on its fuel. When refineries burn and fuel depots have to be moved far to the rear, the gasoline has to be hauled to the front over longer and longer, more and more dangerous distances, often by rail from remote regions like the Urals. Every extra kilometer the supply has to travel is a kilometer on which it can be attacked. An offensive with no fuel grinds to a halt no matter how many tanks wait in reserve. And so the circle closes. The quiet war against the arteries in the rear helps decide whether the loud front can move at all. And how does the fortress respond to all this with outrage but visibly from a defensive crouch? The Kremlin has repeatedly branded German steps like these as fueling the war, accusing Berlin of pushing Ukraine to keep fighting and of sabotaging any path to diplomacy. But that very tone betrays the new reality. Those who speak from a position of strength threaten concrete consequences. Those who do nothing but insult the enemy have already lost the initiative. Moscow is left with the uncomfortable truth that it can hardly answer with targeted retaliation against a delivery whose size it does not know sent to an enemy whose range it cannot gauge without uniting the West even more tightly against it. When you stack all these layers on top of one another, a picture emerges that reaches far beyond a single day in Berlin. A fortress that still looks impregnable from the front has begun to bleed out from within. And the cracks are no longer Western speculation, they are written in the Kremlin's own books. Russia's economy shrank in the first quarter for the first time in 3 years. The economy ministry has slashed its growth forecast for 2026 to a meager 0.4% down from 1.3%. The budget deficit has hit its highest level since the war began in just 4 months, and around 60% of the national wealth fund once Russia's iron cushion has vanished. Inside the halls of power, meanwhile, a fight is raging that has not been this open in a long time. While the finance ministry and the central bank urge cuts to defense, the defense ministry demands even more money. By some accounts, the military's funding gap alone could swell to as much as 3 trillion rubles this year, while Finance Minister Anton Siluanov is reported to have proposed freezing around $40 billion in spending to stabilize the budget. It is a tug of war between those who want to keep waging the war at any cost and those who warn that this very cost is tearing the economy apart because countless Russian companies hang on the drip of defense contracts. Cut defense and part of the economy collapses. Don't cut it and the deficit devours the state. It is the trap of a fortress that can no longer afford its own siege. According to Bloomberg, Putin instructed his finance officials to find the savings elsewhere and leave the military untouched, the clearest sign of an internal split since the invasion began. The Financial Times warns that setbacks on the battlefield and mounting financial pressure could deepen the rifts within the Russian elite and could even threaten Putin's grip on power. This is the logic of a house of cards. As long as each card props up the next, the whole thing looks stable. Pull out the bottom one and everything falls at once. And history knows this pattern all too well. It was not the battlefield alone that toppled the Russian Empire in 1917, but the exhausted supply, the empty granaries, the bread lines in the cities, a war that cost more than the country could bear. Nor was it a single lost campaign that brought down the Soviet Union in 1991, but an economy that could no longer feed its enormous military machine, hollowed out by a grinding Cold War arms race and a hopeless war on its periphery. Empires rarely fall at the front first. They fall at the supply depot at the finance minister's desk in the line outside the empty shop. Today's Russia, too, does not yet hear the thunder at the front as a warning. It is the far quieter sounds, the rustle of budget papers, the click of empty fuel pumps, the silence in the ledgers that its own officials have come to fear. A war machine running out of fuel and money at the same time becomes in the end powerless, no matter how mighty it once appeared, and a war that has become unaffordable cannot be sustained by sheer will alone. No one can say for certain when such a fortress tips over, and it would be dishonest to promise a swift collapse. But the warning signs, the ones the Kremlin can no longer hide, all point almost inevitably in the same direction. And Merz's promise out of Berlin ensures that the pressure on exactly those arteries already under fire does not ease, but grows, which leaves in the end the question hanging over this quiet day in Berlin. Do you believe Germany's about-face can actually shorten the war by striking Russia's war economy at its most sensitive point? Or do you fear that greater range mostly means greater escalation and pushes Moscow toward a dangerous response? There is no easy answer to that, and that is exactly why your view matters so much. Share your thoughts with us in the comments and tell us whether you see Merz's calculated ambiguity as strength or as risk. If you appreciate analysis like this, where we look behind the headlines and trace the unseen lines behind the war, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new episode. Because the situation shifts almost daily, and every new development moves the balance between fortress and siege a little further. And if you'd rather listen to these stories on the go on long drives or long journeys, you can also find us as a podcast on Spotify, where you can follow each analysis at your own pace, far from the noise of breaking news. A fortress may look unshakable from the outside, but as history shows again and again, its fate is not decided at the walls, but at the arteries that keep it alive. And those arteries, from Kiev to Berlin, have long been lying open in the fire,